The woman they'd all written off before she'd even unpacked her locker was the first one through the door when the ceiling came down. Not Dr. Okonkwo, who had 17 years in emergency medicine and a wall of commendations in his office. Not the charge nurse Patel, who ran the floor with the kind of quiet authority that made residents straighten their spines when she walked past. Not the hospital administrator who'd spent the morning reminding everyone that Mercy General Mississauga had a reputation to protect. Cora Stanhope moved first, and nobody, not one person in that corridor, understood why. She'd arrived at Mercy General on a Tuesday in February, which was already a bad sign. Nobody starts anything in February in Ontario. The sky was the color of old cement, the parking lot was a sheet of black ice, and the woman at the HR desk handed Cora her lanyard with the energy of someone handing a parking ticket to a stranger. The lanyard read, "Provisional staff, Cora Stanhope, RN Provisional." The word sat on her chest like a boot. She was 32 years old. She had a nursing degree from Dalhousie, a graduate certificate in trauma care, and 4 years she couldn't put on her resume in any way that would make sense to a civilian. She'd taken the provisional posting because it was the only one available in the entire Greater Toronto area that didn't require her to explain those 4 years in an interview. She'd told the recruiter she'd been working abroad in a medical support capacity. The recruiter had nodded and typed something and moved on, and Cora had let out a breath she'd been holding since she walked in. Nobody needed to know the rest. The floor she'd been assigned to was a mixed medical unit on the 3rd floor, which meant she was nowhere near trauma, nowhere near emergency, and nowhere near anything that would ask too much of her. She understood this was intentional. Provisional nurses didn't get high acuity patients. They got the post-surgical recoveries, the stable cardiac monitoring, the gentle end of the unit where things moved predictably, and the stakes were low enough that a mistake wouldn't cascade. She told herself this was fine. She told herself she needed the quiet. Dr. Okonkwo made his assessment of her on day 3. She'd been checking vitals on a post-op patient in room 318 when he'd come in with his resident, a pale young man named Gefford, who looked like he hadn't slept since September. Okonkwo had barely glanced at Cora before speaking to Gefford as though she were part of the furniture. "Who authorized a provisional on this corridor?" "HR placed her this week, I think," Gefford said, flipping through his chart. Okonkwo had looked at her then, a flat measuring look. "You're comfortable with routine vitals?" Cora had said very evenly, "Yes, good. Let's keep it to that for now." He'd said it without malice. That was almost worse. It wasn't contempt. It was the particular indifference of someone who had already filed her under a category and moved on. Provisional. Low acuity. Not my concern. She finished her charting and didn't say anything else. Nurse Patel was more direct about it, which Cora actually respected. On her 5th day, Patel had pulled her aside near the supply room and told her, without preamble, that the unit didn't have the bandwidth to supervise a provisional with gaps in her employment record, and that if Cora had any concerns or needed guidance on standard procedures, she should ask one of the second-year nurses and not interrupt the senior staff. "I'm not planning to interrupt anyone," Cora said. Patel had looked at her for a moment, the look of someone waiting for a qualifier, an apology, something, and when none came, she'd made a small sound and walked away. Cora went back to her patient rounds. By week 2, the unit had developed a specific texture around her. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was more like the way people navigate around a piece of furniture that's been placed in an inconvenient spot. They worked around her. They passed her in the hallway without quite making eye contact. The other nurses ate lunch in the break room, and Cora ate lunch at the nurses' station because there was always a chart she could be reviewing, and it was easier to be busy than to be excluded. She didn't complain. She didn't explain herself. She answered questions directly, completed every task assigned to her, and went home to her apartment in Port Credit where she cooked something simple and sat by the window and watched the lake go dark. It had taken her 3 years to get here. 3 years of learning how to sleep without keeping one ear open. 3 years of rebuilding the parts of herself that 4 years overseas had worn down to something thin and reflective, like a coin that's been handled too much. She was not entirely sure she'd succeeded, but she was trying in this, the routine, the predictability, the deliberately low stakes. This was the plan. She had not accounted for the Thursday. She was in the supply room on the 2nd floor when it happened. She'd come down to restock her cart. The 3rd floor supply room was perpetually empty of the particular type of IV tubing she needed, and she was counting packages on a shelf when the building moved. Not an earthquake. She knew the specific physics of an explosion, the way the pressure wave arrives before the sound does, the way a building doesn't shake so much as flex, like something large and unhappy shifting in its sleep. She knew it in her sternum before her brain had processed it. The lights went out. The emergency generators kicked in 2 seconds later, flooding the corridor in the flat orange-yellow of backup lighting. From somewhere below her, The main floor, she calculated, possibly the atrium or the cafeteria, came the sound of something enormous giving way. She was already in the corridor before the ceiling dust had finished falling. The stairwell was full of people going up, which was the wrong direction. She pushed past them going down, ignoring someone's shout of "elevators are out," because she wasn't going to the elevators. The main floor atrium was straight through the lobby doors, and the lobby doors were ahead of her, and behind those doors she could hear screaming. She went through them. The atrium had been a food court that morning. Tim Hortons on one side, a small deli on the other, and a seating area with round tables where hospital staff and visitors ate sandwiches and scrolled their phones. What it was now was a ruin. A section of the ceiling had collapsed on the north end, taking with it a structural support column and approximately a third of the deli. Dust hung in the air like fog. Two of the overhead lights were still running, which meant the scene had the specific surreal quality of a disaster that hadn't yet decided whether to be real. There were bodies, at least 4 she could see from the door, some moving, some not. She was moving toward the nearest one before she'd consciously decided to. The nearest person was a man in his 50s in a hospital gown, sitting against the wall with his right hand pressed to his shoulder. His shoulder was wrong. The angle of it, the way he was holding it, told her everything. She crouched in front of him. "Sir, can you hear me?" He focused on her. Yeah, is it a gas leak? I don't know yet. What's your name? Morrison. Ted Morrison. Mr. Morrison, you've dislocated your shoulder. It's not life-threatening. I need you to stay right here and keep your hand exactly where it is, all right? Right here. Don't try to move the arm. He nodded. She was already moving to the next person. The next person was worse. A woman, late 30s, who'd been sitting at one of the tables and had taken the force of something falling, a ceiling panel, a length of pipe, across her lower left leg. She was conscious but going into shock, her skin the wrong color, and her breathing too fast and too shallow. Cora did a rapid assessment without stopping moving, tearing off her lanyard and using it as a compression marker. Not a tourniquet, not yet, but she needed to know where the bleeding was before she could make that call. "Stay with me," Cora said. "What's your name?" Angie. Does Roche? Angie. "You're going to be all right. I'm a nurse. I've got you." She had nothing with her, no bag, no kit. She was in her scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck and a pen in her pocket, and that was it. She stripped off the outer layer of her scrub top, wadded it, pressed it to the wound. "Hold this. As hard as you can." "Can you do that?" She reached down and pressed both hands against the fabric, her face tight with the effort. There was a sound behind Cora, a particular sound, not the structural settling, not the ongoing minor falls of plaster, not the crying, something deliberate, something moving with purpose. She turned her head without standing up. On the far side of the atrium, half obscured by the fallen ceiling section, a man was crouching beside one of the support pillars. He was wearing a maintenance uniform, but he was not looking at the damage. He was looking at his phone. More precisely, he was looking at his phone with the focused expression of someone waiting for a confirmation, not calling for help. She had seen that look before. She had seen it in a market in a city she was not supposed to name, from a distance of 40 meters, on a man who'd been standing too still while everything around him moved. She filed the information. She kept working. There were 6 people in the atrium who needed immediate attention. She worked through them in order of severity, pulling supplies from wherever she could find them. A first aid kit mounted to the wall that was mostly intact, a table that still had napkins on it, a length of electrical cord she could use to stabilize a woman whose wrist was clearly fractured. She talked to each of them. She did not raise her voice. She did not run. When the first of the real medical staff arrived, Dr. Shu from emergency, which was on the main floor, and had apparently taken less damage than the atrium. Cora was on her knees beside a teenager who'd been thrown against a table and was presenting with the specific confusion and uneven pupil response that meant she needed imaging in the next 20 minutes. Shu took in the scene. She took in Cora specifically with the look that Cora had come to recognize from this unit and others. "Provisional 3rd floor, not my concern." "Who authorized you to be down here?" Shu said. "Nobody," Cora said. "Her left pupil is sluggish. She needs a CT now." A beat. "How long has she been like this?" "I found her this way. Maybe 6 minutes." Shu crouched down, checked the girl's eyes herself, and then looked up and called for a gurney in a voice that moved across the atrium like something physical. She did not say thank you to Cora, but she also didn't tell her to leave. Cora got up and went back to work. It was Geffard, the resident, who told her later what had been found in the pillar. She was in the corridor outside the atrium, her hands washed, and her scrubs ruined, and her replacement top 2 sizes too large, because it was the only one in the supply room. The emergency teams had arrived, fire, police, the CBRN unit that arrived, when there was reason to believe an explosion wasn't accidental, and the atrium was taped off and the patients had been moved and the building was on partial lockdown. Geffard found her at the nurses' station, which was where she always ended up when she didn't know what else to do. They found a secondary device, he said. He looked shaken. He was 26 years old and had never been in a building after a bomb went off, and it showed. In the east stairwell. RCMP says whoever placed the first one wasn't supposed to survive the detonation, so they must have had a fail-safe. She kept her expression neutral. Where's the secondary? They said it's been made safe. Some officer, he checked his phone. Sergeant Therio. He said there was a person of interest they'd been monitoring in the atrium, and he stopped. He said someone engaged the individual before the secondary could be triggered. Cora looked at her chart. Did they say who? She asked. No. He paused. Stanhope, did you do something in there that you're not telling anyone about? She thought about the man with the phone by the pillar. She thought about the conversation she'd had with him while pretending to check on a patient nearby. The quiet words, the specific tone of authority she'd had to unlearn, and then relearn and now unlearn again. The moment when she'd had to make a decision in about 3 seconds about how much force to use and on which joints. She thought about the phone which she'd kicked away from him, and the maintenance uniform which had not had a single scuff on it. I was doing patient care, she said. Gefford looked at her for a long moment. He was not unintelligent. She had noticed that about him. Right, he said, and walked away. It was Dr. Okonkwo who came to find her at the end of the shift. She was finishing her incident documentation at a terminal in the far corner of the nurse's station, the one with the wobbly monitor that nobody liked to use, when she heard his footsteps, which she'd learned to recognize, steady and deliberate like a man who'd never rushed and never needed to. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. RCMP is asking for a witness statement from a staff member matching your description, he said. Specifically regarding intervention with a subject in the atrium. I'll file it tomorrow. It's apparently somewhat urgent. I know. She saved the document she was working on. I'll file it tonight then. He was quiet again. She finished what she was doing and turned to look at him. Okonkwo was a man who wore his certainty like a second coat. She had watched him for 2 weeks and had never once seen him uncertain about anything. Not a diagnosis, not a procedure, not a staffing decision. It had not occurred to her, until right now, that there was something almost fragile about that kind of certainty. The way it looked when something came along that didn't fit the category you'd already assigned. The RCMP sergeant asked me about your employment record, Okonkwo said. Specifically the years not on your resume. She waited. I told him I didn't know. That's accurate, she said. He seemed to disagree. She didn't respond to that. Okonkwo exhaled slowly. 3 patients you stabilized in that atrium would have been in significantly worse condition without your intervention, Dr. Shu told me the teenager, the one with the head injury. She said another 15 minutes and the outcome would have been different. Cora said nothing. I would like to know, he said carefully, what kind of nursing you did abroad. She looked at him for a moment. At the commendations he wore in the set of his shoulders. At the 17 years of emergency medicine in the lines around his eyes. The kind, she said, where you don't get to file an incident report afterward. He held her gaze. She held his. Outside, the February wind was doing something to the windows that made them sound like they were breathing. There'll be a debrief tomorrow, he said at last. I'd like you present. I'll be there. He nodded, once the way people nod when they're filing new information under a revised category. Then he walked away. She turned back to the terminal, pulled up the incident form, and started typing. She did not receive a formal commendation. She had not expected one. What she received, 3 weeks later, was a letter, 1 page, printed on hospital letterhead, from the Director of Nursing Services, informing her that her provisional status was being converted to a permanent position effective the 1st of the following month, pending completion of her standard reference checks. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the letter in a different pen. It said, your request to remain on the 3rd floor has been noted and honored. Patel. Cora folded the letter. She put it in the top drawer of her locker. She changed into her scrubs, clipped her new lanyard, the permanent one, which said only Cora Stanhope, RN, without the qualifier, and went to do her morning rounds. In room 318, Mr. Alvarez was recovering from his knee replacement and wanted to tell her about his granddaughter's hockey tournament. She sat on the edge of his visitor chair and listened, and the February light came through the window and was not beautiful exactly, but it was something. It was enough.